All right, let's get into this. We're about to jump into a time machine and head back to the 9th century for a mystery that's part historical detective story and part political thriller. It's all about a man who shows up out of thin air with a story that sounds impossible, and how that story becomes an incredibly powerful weapon in a battle for the very soul of a people.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. You're going about your life, everything's normal, and then one day, a stranger walks into your town. He looks like you, he prays like you, but he's speaking a version of your language that's 1,000 years old. And then he tells you he's from a world, a kingdom, you thought was lost to myth forever.
Well, that is pretty much exactly what happened around the year 884 in a community in North Africa. This visitor's name was Eldad, and he claimed he was from the tribe of Dan, one of the legendary 10 lost tribes of Israel. You know, the ones who had vanished from history over 1,500 years earlier. To say this was a shock, well, that's putting it mildly.
So, who was this guy? Eldad the Danite was a total enigma. He could only communicate in this ancient form of Hebrew, sprinkled with words that nobody had ever heard before. And he didn't just say, hey, I'm from the lost tribes. No, he came with these incredible, epic stories of their hidden, powerful, and totally independent Jewish kingdom.
And his stories were amazing. He painted this picture of a thriving, sovereign nation. He said the tribes of Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher had formed this kingdom of unbelievable warriors, always at war. But here's the kicker. He said they had their own Talmud, their own oral law that they got straight from Moses and Joshua. No later rabbis, no centuries of interpretation, just the pure, original source. And beyond them, the tribe of Levites, living in isolation behind a mythical, magical river. Yeah, this river was a huge part of the story, the Sembatian River. And when I say river, don't picture something calm and peaceful. Eldad described the Sembatian as this raging, impassable torrent of rocks and sand. It churned violently for 6 days a week, making it impossible to cross. But then, and this is the miracle, on the Sabbath, it would become completely still. It was the perfect divine barrier protecting the holy Levites from the rest of the world. So you have to ask, why did this story cause such an explosion? To get that, we have to understand the world Eldad just walked into. It was anything but peaceful. It was basically a pressure cooker of deep religious arguments and intense political rivalries. At this time, you had two major power centers in the Jewish world, and they were both competing for the title of the true authority. Over in Babylon, in modern-day Iraq, you had the big shot academies and the Exilarch, a kind of hereditary leader. They thought they were the top dogs. But then you had the sages back in the historic land of Israel who were fighting to keep their own influence over all the Jewish communities scattered around the globe. And it wasn't just a political rivalry. Oh no. There was this huge philosophical divide. On one side, you had the Rabbanites. This was mainstream Judaism. They believed that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received two things, the written Torah and an oral law that was eventually written down as the Talmud. But on the other side was a growing movement called the Karaites. They rejected the Talmud completely, calling it a man-made invention. For them, only the written Bible was sacred. This was the debate of the time. So, into this fiery cauldron of debate walks Eldad, with a story that could change everything. But was any of it true? This is where we put on our detective hats and start investigating this mystery. First question, and it's the most basic one, did this guy, Eldad the Danite, even exist? Or was he maybe just a fictional character from the get-go? And the verdict is in. Yeah, he was almost certainly a real person. We have multiple independent sources that mention him. A famous 10th century vizier talks about a man from the tribe of Dan showing up. Another grammarian mentions the encounter. So a guy matching Eldad's description was definitely walking the earth in the 9th century. Okay, so the man was real. That's settled. But what about the stories? The warrior kingdom, the ancient Talmud, the magical river? Was he telling the truth, or was he a world-class storyteller? Maybe even a brilliant con artist? So how do you even figure that out 1,000 years later? Well, historians have this cool method. They basically become textual detectives. They hunt down every single version of the story they can find, they lay them all out, compare them line by line, and work their way backwards to find the oldest, simplest version, the original little seed of the myth. And then they can see what got added on later. And this is what they discovered. The basic idea wasn't new. There were already older, shorter legends floating around about the lost tribes being pure and righteous. But Eldad's version, It's like a Hollywood blockbuster remake. It's told in the first person, I was there, and it's packed with new details, names of kings, specific battle tactics, a whole personal adventure story. So here's the crucial part. Eldad didn't invent the story out of thin air. He, or whoever was telling the story as Eldad, took an existing legend and supercharged it. So if the story wasn't, a factual travel report, then what was it? This is where it gets really interesting. Because the story of Eldad wasn't just a story. It was a tool. In fact, it became a weapon in the great ideological wars of the 9th century. First, you have to put yourself in the shoes of his audience. These are Jewish communities scattered across the globe, living as minorities, with no army, no political power, and then they hear this story, and it's like a shot of pure hope. It's a vision of everything they didn't have: Jewish strength, Jewish independence, a kingdom that was clearly favored by God. Now, watch what the people in power do with this powerful wave of hope. The head of that big Babylonian academy, a rabbi named Zamach, hears the story. He writes a letter about it, and in his version, he adds this one little detail, a detail you can't find anywhere else. He claims the lost tribes start all their prayers by blessing, you guessed it, the sages of Babylon. Just like that, he hijacked the myth to make it seem like even this lost kingdom recognized his academy as the supreme authority. Pretty clever, right? And that was just the beginning of the battle for this story. Remember that huge fight between the Rabbanites and the Karaites? Well, both sides grabbed Eldad's story and claimed it as their own. The Rabbanites said, see, even the lost tribes have a Talmud. That proves the oral law is ancient and comes from God. But the Karaites spun it completely differently. They said, look, the tribes are righteous and pure without your fancy Mishnah and Talmuds. That proves all that stuff is man-made and we don't need it. It was the exact same story being used as proof for two totally opposite beliefs. So Eldad the Danite, whether he was a prophet, a performer, or maybe something in between, he unleashed a myth that just took on a life of its own. It's a story that continued to echo for centuries. This saga of Eldad is so much more than just a weird old story. It reveals some deep truths. It shows us that the truth of a myth often has nothing to do with facts. Its real power comes from the human needs it fulfills. The need for hope, the need for identity, the need for someone to say you're right. It shows us that traditions aren't set in stone. They're constantly being remixed and reinterpreted. And maybe most importantly, it shows us that the past is always a battleground, where people fight to control the narrative. And that really brings us right back to today, with a question that's just as relevant now as it was in the 9th century. Think about the big stories that define our own world, our nations, our politics, our identities. What are those stories that shape our reality? And more importantly, whose purpose do they serve?